Welcome to the Explainer. I am genuinely thrilled you're joining us today because we're taking a deep dive into one of the absolute most fascinating dichotomies in modern vestibular care. We are looking closely at the driver-passenger paradox. It's an incredibly insightful framework that separates how our brains handle predictive motor control versus reactive sensory processing. Today, we're going to break down exactly what is happening in the nervous system of patients experiencing dizziness. I love this topic because it takes something we do every single day, riding in a car, and uses it to completely decode the brain's internal microenvironment. So let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the ultimate mystery we're solving today. Picture this. Two patients, both dealing with severe dizziness. They both get into a car. For one of them, the simple act of driving actually brings relief. But for the other, getting behind that wheel triggers a catastrophic spike in symptoms. It's wild, right? How can the exact same high-speed, dynamic environment produce two completely opposite neurological reactions?
Well, to understand this, we have to look at two distinct clinical profiles. First up, we have the stabilized driver. This is the patient who mechanically needs control of the vehicle to feel grounded. And completely opposing them is the provoked driver, a patient who's just totally overwhelmed, totally crippled by active navigation. This paradox is absolutely crucial because knowing whether a patient thrives behind the wheel or panics tells us exactly what's failing in their brain. So let's start by looking at our first profile.
Section 1. Hardware failure. The stabilized driver.
So who exactly is the stabilized driver? Typically, we're talking about patients dealing with a hardware failure. Think of bilateral vestibular hypofunction, meaning their inner ear just can't send proper balance signals. To these folks, a moving car is this unpredictable, highly threatening environment. Well, unless they're the ones driving. The reason they actually need to drive comes down to this brilliant neurological mechanism called the efference copy. When this patient sits in the driver's seat, their central nervous system gains a massive predictive advantage. Because the inner ear's hardware is essentially broken, the brain compensates by generating its own predictive signal straight from the motor cortex. It's basically telling the body what's about to happen before it even happens, bypassing that faulty vestibular signaling entirely. Let's actually walk through this internal feed-forward loop step by step. First, the driver initiates a movement, like turning the steering wheel. Second, the motor cortex fires off that efference copy. Third, the vestibular nuclei receive this predictive signal. And finally, the brain facilitates a complete functional reset. Because your brain knows exactly what visual and somatosensory shifts are coming up, it literally overrides the dizziness. The physical act of driving acts as a mechanical bypass for the inner ear. It's incredible. And this really emphasizes why the physical components of the car matter so much. You see, the steering wheel and pedals aren't just controls. They provide a strong somatosensory component. The driver's brain is literally employing this direct, physical, kinesthetic link to ground their internal spatial map. They are, quite literally, holding onto their balance. Now, what's really interesting here is what happens when we take that wheel away. We introduce a concept called ex-afference, passive sensory input without a corresponding motor command. This, right here, is the passenger crisis. When our hypofunction patient moves over to the passenger seat, they lose that efference copy. The predictive signal is just gone. They're taking in massive amounts of visual movement from the road, but their failed inner ear can't confirm the physical shift. This creates an unresolvable sensory mismatch, which leads to severe disorientation. They are entirely at the mercy of a reactive system that simply cannot keep up with the velocity of a moving car.
Section 2. Software failure. The provoked driver.
Our second profile represents a software failure. These are patients dealing with things like persistent postural perceptual dizziness, PPPD, or folks with extremely high visual dependency. Their inner ear hardware, totally fine, but their sensory processing software is failing them. In direct contrast to our first profile, these patients often report feeling absolutely horrible behind the wheel. Driving is their primary provocation. Now, they aren't struggling with a lack of signaling. Actually, scratch that, it's more like they're suffering from a failure in the sensory pivot. The active cognitive load required to drive is simply way too much for their sensory integration system to handle. To grasp why this happens, we have to look at a concept called vection. This is that illusion of self-motion you get from passing cars and road flow. Driving demands incredibly high-intensity focal and peripheral visual processing. For a hypersensitive brain, this optical flow is treated as a high-priority threat. The patient is instantly plunged into optokinetic overload. The active navigation needed to drive causes their entire internal spatial map to just collapse under the visual stress. So the absolutely crucial point here is this concept of the active burden. Unlike the hardware patient who uses the steering wheel to ground themselves, our software patient finds that the steering wheel is a total trap. Every tiny steering correction they make generates a brand new sensory error feedback loop, and the brain just cannot facilitate these corrections in real time. Trying to control the car creates this vicious cycle of sensory errors, causing their symptoms to skyrocket. This brings us to a massive aha moment in clinical observation: the backseat strategy. Ever wonder why these highly visually dependent patients actually prefer the backseat over riding shotgun? It's because it provides crucial visual occlusion. It physically restricts all that overwhelming optokinetic flow. By using the front seats as a stable visual frame, the patient's brain can finally zero out those provocative stimuli and drastically reduce the exhausting demand on their visual system. Section 3. The research behind the paradox. Validating the clinical dichotomy. And this brilliantly illustrates what happens when we synthesize the data side by side. When we compare these two drivers, we see a perfect mirror image of dysfunction. Profile 1, the hypofunction patient, finds relief driving through that efference copy, but suffers terribly as a passenger due to sensory mismatch. Profile 2, the visual dependency patient, finds driving highly provocative due to optokinetic overload, but actually improves as a passenger in the back seat by using visual occlusion. This isn't just an elegant theory, it's heavily backed by recent literature. For instance, research from Van Helvert and colleagues in 2022 confirms that predictive steering acts as a functional bypass for those with vestibular loss. On the flip side, a 2023 study from Ainsworth shows that in functional cases like motorist disorientation syndrome, the visual signaling from the road aggressively overtakes the motor command. We're looking at two completely distinct, validated neural pathways. To sum up these core mechanics, we really just need to ask ourselves a simple question. What is actually failing here? Is it a hardware issue, where the physical inner ear is failing to predict and confirm sensory inputs? Or is it a software issue, where the neurological integration system is failing to filter out the overwhelming optical flow? In short, a failure of sensory input versus a failure of sensory integration. Section 4. The clinical imperative. Moving beyond generalized exercises. Understanding this distinction brings us to the clinical imperative. How do we take this incredibly cool data and use it in the real world? Well, it's about moving past generalized one-size-fits-all treatments and using these clues for accurate diagnostic coding and targeted treatment planning. Our approach has to fundamentally change based on the profile. For the hypofunction patient, driving shouldn't be feared. It should actually be encouraged. It's a fantastic compensatory strategy to optimize those intact motor pathways. But for the PPPD patient, our therapy has to focus on retraining the brain. We have to support them in pivoting away from that overwhelming visual dominance and back toward a strong somatosensory component. This duality is exactly why the driver-passenger paradox is considered a cornerstone of the developing Werner sensory integration method. Methodologies like this rely on identifying these maladaptive strategies early on. By tailoring the intervention to whether the patient needs prediction or processing, we can profoundly optimize patient outcomes and safely return them to the road with confidence. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Whether you're a clinician, a student, or just someone fascinated by how the brain works, ask yourself, are you looking beyond the mere physical deficit? Are you truly trying to understand the deeply complex internal microenvironment of your patient's sensory integration? The answers are often sitting right in front of us, whether they're in the driver's seat or the back seat. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.